This is divergent thinking. Now, some companies are trying to make up for their lack of this by having right brain meetings. That's what they call them. Because the right brain is responsible for creativity and intuition, the left brain for analysis and logic. So they're having right brain meetings. At 4 o'clock today, we're going to turn on the right brain. So, are you ready to go with the right brain at 4 o'clock today? Listen, the brain doesn't work that way. Left brain, right brain, they're just pictures to help us understand a much more complex mechanism. Neuroscientists admit they don't really understand how the brain works. Even today, we don't understand it. It's an amazingly holistic, complex organism. It doesn't think in two halves. Ideas come when they're least expected. You can't turn them on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I like to say ideas don't hang out in singles bars. Ideas just don't appear out of nowhere. New ideas always arise out of existing associations between old ideas. We talk about this today in ideas theory. We call it the adjacent possible. That new ideas only emerge as we explore the connections between existing possibilities. Do you know that almost every great invention, if you look back at, let's say, British history, if you look at some of the great innovations that have come out of Britain, almost all of them have had a multiple at the same time. Someone over here is inventing the telephone, someone over here is working on a similar device and they don't know about it. Someone here, same thing happened in the radio. Same thing happened with a steam engine. More than one person at the same time working quite separately on the same thing. Why is that possible? Because of this idea of the adjacent possible. Ideas feed off existing ideas in the plateau, in the plane at the same time. Here's a good example. Charles Babbage. Anybody ever heard of him? He was a London mathematician, philosopher, great inventor. In the 1830s, he developed two machines, theoretically. He couldn't build them, either of them, because the parts didn't exist yet. That's how far ahead he was. But in theory, they were very important to the subsequent history of invention and technology. One was called the difference engine. The difference engine, if he had been able to build it, would have been the fastest mechanical calculator in history. 100 years after his birth, the London Science Museum invented one or built one of these contraptions. Remember, it's not digital, it's mechanical. And it was accurate to 31 places in seconds. That's like your washing machine doing calculations to 31 places in seconds. It's a mechanical object that can do things with that accuracy. It's amazing. It's incredible. In the century after his death, although he couldn't build it in his lifetime, several other people began to build components of this and used that idea to launch other inventions. At around the same time, though, he was working on the analytical engine, which in theory became the world's first programmable computer. This is in the 1830s, and he was a Brit. Computer scientists today recognise he was the first one to build, at least in his head, a computer as we know them. He even came up with the word program. He talked about programs being inserted in the machine with punch cards. Punch cards, which, by the way, had already been invented for the textile mills. He was using them with his theoretical computer. Now, unlike the difference machine, nobody after his death could do anything with this idea. It was 100 years after he died that anybody actually built a computer. Nobody could use the idea, nobody could apply it. Why? There was no adjacent possible at the time. There was nothing else around that could feed into it and make it doable. Are you still with me? Around that time in history, people like Milton and Bacon and Locke and other thinkers used to keep what they call a commonplace book. And I think this would be a really good thing in the digital age. A commonplace book. Just a book. It's a bit like we use Twitter, some of us today, to store quotes, excerpts from books, ideas, vague hunches that occurred to them during the day. They'd write them in their commonplace book. Over the years, this became an encyclopedia of ideas for them. Some of them would go back years later and look at their commonplace book and see how an idea had formed over time in their mind. Interesting concept, isn't it? One of these books was published and sold. It had a rather grandiose title, Inquire Within About Everything. Sounds like Wikipedia today, doesn't it? Inquire within about everything. And you think that's a bit corny. But this book went through 100 different printings and was still on people's bookshelves here in Britain in the 1960s. Families still had it in their bookshelves. In fact, one such couple of mathematicians, had it in their bookshelf in the living room. Their young son used to love reading through it. He was fascinated, not just by the name, but by the idea that you could connect a lot of ideas in one place. You could go to one point and connect a whole lot of different ideas. A few years later, as a young adult, he was working for a Swiss research lab. He came up with an application to track the changes of information and people flow in his organisation. He called the application Enquire, after this book. 10 years after that, still in his spare time, he wasn't paid to do this British man invented a much more powerful application that allowed him to access documents from different computers using what he called hypertext protocol. His invention, of course, was called the World Wide Web. His name, a Brit, Tim Berners-lee. You see how the Commonplace book helped to give birth to a much bigger Commonplace book called the World Wide Web. It didn't come out of nowhere. This world-changing, game-changing idea was built on the adjacent possible. The web itself is an example of association. It started out just text. Then it became audio and text. Then it became commerce and audio and text. Then it became video and audio and commerce and text. And now it's almost haptic. You can almost physically interact on the cutting edge of the internet today. It's the association of ideas that make new ideas possible.